Hello, Psychology of Religion students. And this video will be talking about grief. There's so much more that we could say in just 15 minutes or so in this video, but we'll try our best to approach the process of grief primarily. It's been said in ancient wisdom that children who experience grief at an early age, how fortunate you are to grieve while you are young. You will recognize that grief is a part of life. It's normal. It happens to all of us. And there's some words we need to define up front to help it better make sense. One would be the word bereavement. Bereavement, and think of it as a state that one is after having a loss. Bereavement is a state. Then there is mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, mourning, which is a process that you go through in adapting to the loss of a loved one. And then the word grief, which we've already used. Think of grief as an experience. It's an experience that each of us individually goes through. Bereavement, a state; mourning, a process; grief, an experience. And is grief ever really over? I was talking to a client once, and I asked, how are you doing getting over it? And he replied, well, how high is up? And he said, does my grief ever really get over? Well, it erupts less frequently now. So that was staying with him for a long time. And we're going to first talk about some tasks. There are many different models, but let's first of all think of it as 4 tasks. And the first task is to acknowledge the reality of loss. There's a best-selling book by Joan Didion, a screenwriter, called The Year of Magical Thinking. And in her story that she tells, her only daughter, she and her husband were screenwriters, her only daughter was hurt in a traffic accident very badly, lying in a coma, didn't know if she was going to make it, and they stayed with their daughter and finally came back to eat dinner at their apartment. And while they were eating dinner, she saw her husband just stare at her, and then he fell down face first into the food and died of a heart attack right in front of her. And then their daughter died shortly afterwards. And then the pain that she went through, she described it as a line of disbelief. And she called her next year the Year of Magical Thinking. It's difficult to acknowledge the reality of a loss, but the truth was life had dealt her a very cruel deck of cards in a short period of time. And so it can be hard to acknowledge it, especially if it's what's called a socially unacceptable loss, such as a suicide or someone dies of AIDS or something like that. Or there are socially negated issues, which just means people don't talk about it, like, say, miscarriages or abortion. And so people just keep it inside themselves. But first step, you got to acknowledge it. Secondly, experience the pain. Experience the pain. Nobody likes the pain. Nobody knows how to talk about it. We minimize it. We become numbed by it. And some people have a better adaptation than others, but we have to fully experience it, to cry it out, to deal with it. Anger and guilt come up a lot of it, and that's why it's often helpful to have grief counseling or be in a grief group. The third task is adjusting to the environment without the deceased there. And there's an external adjustment where you just have to pay the bills, deal with an empty house, all those things, like for widows or widowers. But we think more of the internal adjustments, how it affects my sense of self. It's that strange experience where you turn to share something that's happened to you with a loved one who's no longer there. When I was promoted to colonel in the U.S. Army, my dad had just died weeks before. And the one person I really wanted to share that with more than anyone was my dad, who was a young 22-year-old sergeant there on D-Day in World War II, and would have been so proud to have known his oldest son became a colonel. But, that just wasn't able to do that. It was an adjustment for me to not be able to share it. I didn't have a dad anymore. And then the other adjustment is a spiritual adjustment. I was speaking once to an 85-year-old woman who, at a young age in her marriage, had her husband die and left her with 2 children, ages 4 and 8. And all these years she thought God was angry with her, and that's why. Not true at all, but that's how she had felt for almost 60 years. And the fourth task of mourning is coming to relocate and memorialize. Relocate and memorialize. It may not mean that you actually move to a new location, but some do. Took my mother 3 years to finally move from the farm that she had lived on with my dad and raised her children, and she knew she needed to move into town. And she finally called me one day and said, "Terry, God filled me with faith. I believe I can now make the move." That was about 8 in the morning, and at noontime she called me, and she said, "Terry, I'm homeless." And I said, "What?" She said, "Yeah, I called your Uncle Dave this morning. We put a sign out in front of our house, and they're way out in the boonies, and a car came by. It was a couple from Florida who used to live in the area. They saw the sign. They pulled in while my uncle, the realtor, was still there. They walked through the house and said, 'We'll buy it at the asking price.'" And so she sold her house in one morning, and it was like God was answering the cry of her heart, where she could finally relocate to the city now and be in a better and safer place. And memorialize, of course, we typically do that through the headstones or a memorial or something like that, a place to remember them. Now, this is just a part of life. I want to mention a psalm to you, Psalm 31, verse 9, and the first part of verse 10, where it says, "Have mercy upon me, O Lord, for I'm in trouble. My eye wastes away with grief, yes, my soul and my body. My life is spent with grief, and my years with sighing." It's simply a part of life. We're all going to grieve. We're going to lose persons. A couple years ago at Christmas time, I'd stopped in the Fiesta Mexico restaurant in Campbellsville. I saw a Lindsey Wilson alum eating dinner there. He'd only graduated a couple years ago. And I kind of kidded him. I said, "Hey, you're eating alone?" And he gave me this long look. And then with tears in his eyes, he said, "Dr. Swan, my wife died at Christmas." And this was in late January when I saw him. And how painful to have just graduated from college, started your professional career, gotten married, and then already you had lost your loved one. Grief is kind of like waves. Like if some of you have been in the ocean and the grief comes and the waves hits you, but you don't fight it. You just kind of think of grief like the waves. It just comes, it hurts, but you'll get through it. It simply happens to all of us, and it comes at different times, and we learn to deal with it. I think of grief as 3 T's. In getting through it, it takes talk, it takes time, and it takes tears. It's both a letting go, and it's a holding on. Lindemann, Lindmann, says the success in which you move through the grief seems to be doing the grief work, which he thinks is your emancipation from the deceased. What he really means by that is that you are no longer in bondage to that person. You still love them, you have an attachment, you always miss them, but that you're able to move on and live your life in the present. And of course, we're living in the land of the dying. Those who have gone on to the next world are living in the land of the living. Rubin, R-U-B-I-N, looks at it in 3 stages. And this has to do primarily with the intensity of emotion for grief. And the first stage would be the acute grief period. Acute grief period. It's very dramatic. You think about it all the time. For example, when my father died, we drove all the way up to Wisconsin. I was very much involved with trying to be the oldest son and be with my family members, especially my mother, who, by the way, has no memory of the funeral. It was so painful to lose her husband of over 5 decades, almost 6, that she doesn't remember a thing about the funeral itself. It was that painful, acute grief during that time. Then after spending a week up there, and I came back to Lindsey Wilson, and of course it's such a wonderful place. My email box was jammed full of condolences. I had a whole stack of cards. There's so many beautiful people. And my first day at the job, I don't know how I got through it, But I came home, pulled into the garage in which I had lived in this house for, I don't know, 15 years at that point, and still deeply in thought. I accidentally did not pull the car all the way in. I pushed the garage door opener, and the garage door opener came down in the back of my bumper and broke it in the back. And when it happened, I just forgave myself. It was stupid. My head was not right. I was just going through the acute grief stage. Then the second stage is the mourning period. It usually goes on for a matter of many weeks, even into the months. And the third stage is a sense of resolution. And resolution is where you finally move to a place of not getting past it totally, but you finally resolve, this is what my life will be like. This person will never be here. Weisman, W-E-I-S-M-A-N, differentiates between three types of untimely deaths, which are more difficult to handle. You have premature deaths, like when you have the death of a child, or here at Lindsay we have the death of a student. Premature deaths are very difficult to deal with. You have unexpected, and you know those moments when you got that phone call where somebody you knew just went just like that. They're in an accident or something, and that's hard as well because it cuts you off at the knees. And then the last that he mentions are calamitous deaths, and that's where it's not only unpredictable, but the death was violent or destructive, degrading. This could include a person being murdered or a suicide, and that's very hard to get over that. And finally, we'll mention just a couple other types of complicated bereavement that people go through. There's delayed grief, which is often the kind of grief that first responders go through, or people in the military where you've seen deaths of others and you're not able to deal with it then, or maybe you saw death when you were a child, you weren't mature enough to deal with it then, and so you deal with it many years later. And that would be delayed grief. And then there's chronic grief. Chronic grief is where, let's just say even 3 years later, you're still not getting over it. And I've met numbers of clients like that who, just because of the pain, are still stuck. They're still stuck in the midst of it, and never perhaps will get over it. It's chronic. Then there's exaggerated grief. Exaggerated grief, it would be experiences similar to normal grief, but it's escalated to a point that it impairs your life, your health. It becomes so painful. As you know, grief can kill you. Grief can kill you. I had a couple I knew of in Greene County, and they both seemed to be in relatively good health. The husband is kind of a chauvinist. It bothered me a little bit about how he talked to his wife. But suddenly she just died of a stroke like that. And I did her funeral. And then I told the family, keep an eye on Frank, because Frank acts like a big macho John Wayne man, but you know how he depended upon his wife, because I'm concerned that he was actually the weaker one in the relationship. And sure enough, 3 months later, he died. And I did his funeral. And that was the exaggerated grief, and it killed him. And then the last one we'll mention would be called masked grief. M-A-S-K-E-D, masked grief. And that's where you see in persons other medical conditions or symptoms, but the real issue that's going on is unresolved grief. It'll manifest in different ways, but the main result is that they're dealing with deep pain, and like with the other types of grief, it can even kill you eventually. So that's grief. People use the term good grief. Since grief is inevitable, let's accept it as a part of life and learn to handle it and teach others to do it as well. Thank you.